and welcome to Disaster 365. This morning, we're taking the program directly to the Understanding Risk Caribbean Conference that took place last week in Barbados. In studio, we have Mr. Jeremy Collymore, Consultant, Disaster Resilience, Office of the Vice Chancellor. Mr. Collymore recently conducted a session titled Towards Resilient States, Tools and Good Practices. And this morning, we want to take the conversation to the shores of TCI so we can understand the community program and engagement that we must implement to guide our nation towards resilience, based on the lessons learned and Mr. Collymore's recommendations.
Well, first of all, I would like to start by looking at what lessons we learned from recent events and this conference to see how these apply to community enhancement and in particular in the territories. The 2017 events demonstrated the kind of extensive catastrophe and loss that can occur in our states, where many communities are left outside the communication, information, and resource loop of the state. And that means that communities have to become resilient entities in themselves. They must be able to understand the threats that are posed to the communities, some idea of what this is likely to do, and the resources they have that could address those expected consequences. This is very important because very often we have community plans that are not aligned to the resource gaps. We are saying frequently that the events are overwhelming the demands not only of communities but of states. And we therefore have to examine where are we going to get the resources to meet those gaps, whether it's shelter, whether it's food, whether it's transportation and communication. If you don't start with that foundation, you're really having a community disaster plan that is a document.
So understanding the dynamics and the resources that are available to the community would help us to ensure that the community plans are aligned, and this is critical to the foundation of community resilience. There was a tool mentioned in this session called the Social Vulnerability Index. Can you tell us how this is incorporated?
The Social Vulnerability Index and the engagement tool. Getting a sense of how communities perceive the risk in their own spaces is important because we have to have a sense of what they're thinking, and so if there is need to be information adjustments to allow them to deal with these impacts appropriately, that has to be identified and shared. We're not talking about an exotic kind of experience. We're talking about simple things. What can happen in our community? Where can it happen? Who will be impacted? Who do we go to address the consequences if we don't have the resources ourselves? So if you personalize it as an individual, as a household, it starts there. Because if your individual household is impacted, then you will realize that you yourself may need help. Where are you going to go for help? And when you have that collective demand for recognition of need for support, then you're going to get the community structures emerging. So my recommendation always is, let's start by asking the question, how is you and your family preparing to deal with the threats in your communities? What are the community resources that you would like to call upon to assist you? Or who is likely to call upon you? And that starts with ownership.
So as individuals and organizations, both private and public, it is critical for us to understand how do we truly perceive risk. Have we done our resource assessments at a household level and at a community level? Do we truly understand the nature and the dynamics of our different communities and the constraints that exist on our resources? Only when we've done these assessments, we'd be able to develop different programs for the various communities in the Turks and Caicos and gain adequate information to make informed decisions towards true community resilience.
In essence, community programming must be seen as the foundation for national programming. Very often we start with the national programming and then we try to reach out to communities.
We have to start from
So we have to start by scoping out what their needs are. So they are really the constituents of the people. Right? So once you have broad policies, how we operationalize them, bring them into practice, needs to build the community consultation and engagement. And that is what many of these tools that are presented at Understanding Risk Conference will be available. And I think consideration and use among the persons who lead community preparedness programs in the territories would be a good way of expanding their knowledge base and resource base to inform community level disaster or resilience program in its wider sense.
What is the consequence of doing assessments or plans without going to the community and conducting these risk assessments beforehand? What's going to happen?
Well, I hope that nobody will want to do a community assessment, a risk assessment before going to the communities. I guess some people use secondary data to do that.
Yeah.
But we talk about, it is more than just about collecting information. It's about information exchange. Understanding, correcting misunderstandings, and also information gaps. So we hope it's not simply a elicitation exercise that I ask you questions, you give me information, but it's a more dialogue about, okay, is this resource adequate for you? But why, let's say a bed, but then we find people say, well, this beds are not good for old people, right? So it may well be that your shelter material have to be different to reflect the ages of your population. Yeah. So that kind of connection will tell you if you're in an area where we have a lot of old people, a shelter requirement will be different from one we have a lot of young mobile people.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Collymore. Before you go, is there any final words that you'd like to share with the public?
I like to connect what I learn to what I say. And one of the things that emerged very strongly from the session on towards resilient states, good tools and practices, is one, that there is a high percentage of people who are at the frontiers of high vulnerability, and a disaster or hazard impact of a significant magnitude could be a tipping point where we have from a low percentage of vulnerable to high percentage of vulnerable. That is, we now must start looking at what our data is telling us about our profile, and we address what I call the complacency that is now evident at the national levels in terms of the resources committed to the disaster management program. It is more than a hurricane program.
It's much more.
Yes, much more than that. And if that message is not getting through yet, we have a problem.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining Disaster 365. See you next week, Wednesday at 9:15, right here on Radio Turks and Caicos.